All right, today we are going to. I was really satisfied with the most recent episode of the Wordy Pair podcast because what Justin does is he he makes a really good case for going and watching the original Beetlejuice movie, and then he proceeds to make a really strong case to not watch the sequel. Um, it's one of those things where there's all these great things to say about the original movie. Like it's got that kind of like Tim Burton dark but fun environment. It's got very energetic and very entertaining, and it's got a good message at the end, and like there's some character development and all this good stuff. And then you look at the sequel, and they took all the fun out of it, right? It went from darkly fun to just dark. And even worse, like some of the writing choices are really bad. It's another one of those movies where it kind of turns out as if it's like written as vignettes, like a bunch of 10-minute vignettes that have been sewn together into a movie, as opposed to like a cohesive total. We have a ton of fun talking about it with a ton of like weird references. We even referenced the MASH theme song from the TV show, which it was a couple of weeks ago that I brought this up actually as an episode, as a video here, because we had just talked about it when making the podcast. But there's just so much really, really bad artistic choices in the sequel compared to the original that is just mind blowing. And so we have a ton of fun talking about that. And then just a little bit of a little bit of funny stuff to kind of whet your appetite. After we talk about Beetlejuice for a little over an hour, Justin goes into this tangent about Dragon Ball Super. So much so that we almost named the episode Beetle Ball Super, but we ended up calling it Beetlejuice Bait and Switch, because that's really what it is. And this has been a trend in a lot of stuff lately, where there's a sequel or a remake or something like that, and it changes the tone of the original, or it changes its tone compared to the original, depending on whether it's a remake or a sequel, so much that it's almost unrecognizable to fans of the original. And it's like, you can do that, right? From a writing perspective, you can do that, but you have to justify it, and you can't just hand wave that away. The example that we get into in the first one is that in the original Beetlejuice movie, what's her name, Lydia? She gets a positive push from her interaction with the ghost world, right? She kind of is flirting with, negative thoughts, and she turns that, with the help of these ghost characters, into something that's genuinely positive for her life. She goes from someone who's doesn't even have the energy to go to school, kind of thing, to someone who's actually starting to excel in her studies, and live a happier, more fulfilling life. The overall message of the original is, don't go to the world of the dead. It's not as good here as you can make it in real life. That's a great message, right? And then the sequel, she is one of the few people who can actually communicate with the world of the dead, and she knows that she can really do it. She knows it's real, right? She's not cold reading people, which is what a lot of these what do you call it? People who do like ghost readings do, right? They cold read you, and they tell you things that that may or may not be true about the people who you've lost. There's a really good episode of Penn and Teller's Bullshit on it, way back in the day, where they're like, well, wait a minute, this is not actually helping you cope in a productive way. It's helping you cope by lying to you, is what the cold readers are doing. And Lydia, adult Lydia, now, in Beetlejuice, knows that she's not doing that. She knows that she's actually providing real information to people, and she's suffering slings and arrows because of this, right? She's being called a faker, right, by lots of people, which is just something that you would have to consider if you were going to provide this information that you're getting from a non-provable source. And so there's a nobility to it, or at least there should be, right? Yes, I realize that I'm going to get a lot of people who disbelieve what I'm saying, but I know deep down in my heart that I'm telling them the truth and not just tricking them, as some people would want to do for fun and profit, right? And so there's a really good like seed in the sequel for this to happen, but in the end, she like, or in the sequel, Beetlejuice, she's like, well, this is making me very, very sad that I have to go through this kind of thing, which is like, it's stupider than the character should be, I guess, right? Because it's like, well, yeah, of course people are gonna think that you're lying to them when you tell them that you're talking to ghosts and the ghosts are telling you X, Y, Z. I mean, like, if you were gonna do this, you should have known from the beginning this was gonna be a result that you were gonna have to deal with, either by convincing people, right, which is one thing you could do. You could tell them things that only their lost loved ones could know, or you just bear it, right? Like, and that can be hard, but you'd have the knowledge deep in your heart that you're telling the truth, right? And neither of these seem to be the way that they develop the character in Beetlejuice. And so, go check out the podcast where Justin talks in a lot more detail than I do. But like, anyway, it's a fun episode. It's super fun, and we get into this whole like switching over things of like sequels being pulled in a very, very distant direction from their originals without sufficient justification. The people who complain about this are not complaining that the characters have changed. They're complaining that there's not a good justification for the characters making that change, right? We've seen this in like the Star Wars sequels. We've seen this in a lot of different places recently, and it seems to be a thing where people creating new movies that are like kind of glomming on to a previously existing property want to tell their own stories, which is perfectly fine, but at the same time they're telling a story that's so different from the original, and they're not willing to put in the time and effort to make that connection. One of the hard things about writing is that you can't always just write exactly what you want. You can't just produce something that is related to an old thing and have it be completely new and have everybody completely different in it. I mean, you could get away with it if you were doing some kind of surrealistic thing where their brains are getting switched out. There would have to be, but the point is that there has to be a justification for it. Otherwise, the world that they're in doesn't seem to make sense. And in the world of fiction, in the world of fantasy fiction, right, where things are not just like, yeah, this is the world, but it's a part of the world I haven't seen. But, it does seem basically realistic. Like Nero Wolfe is a good example, right? There's no magic in Nero Wolfe. There's a smart guy, and there's a hardworking guy, and, Wolfe and Archie, and they work together to solve these mysteries. And there's no, like, oh, yeah, this person is a space miner from 2074. There's no time travel. Or, that's a realistic setting, and therefore, you would expect to find realistic things in it. There are recurring characters, and the recurring characters are all consistent from one book to the next. And, every new book you learn something new about that character. Whereas, in far fantasy, there can be all kinds of crazy cool things that happen, right? But at the same time, if you're building upon an existing base, you need to connect to that base. And so if you want to write your own story, you need to, like, either write your story in a place that doesn't refer to the original base, which you could do, right? Like, you could write an Aliens universe story, or an Alien universe story, right? From, Ridley Scott, Alien, Cameron, Aliens, etc., etc., etc. You could write a story that takes place with a different corporation in a different part of the galaxy with a different cast of characters that makes no reference to, the existing lore. And if you sufficiently distanced it, then you could tell your own story without worrying about referring to the back. But the temptation that these high-paid writers usually go for is they want a lot of references. They want to say, "Ooh, let's refer to Ripley's closing speech from Alien. Let's refer to Bishop. Let's refer to Ash. Let's refer to this, or let's refer to that." And the more of those references you drag into your story, the more careful you have to be to make sure that those references make sense in the framework of the original story. The example would be like, well, wait a minute. The whole point of Alien, right? The whole point of the character Ash in Alien is that they didn't know he was a synthetic person. They were like, yeah, he's just the science officer. We got a new science officer. He's a little weird, but, whatever. The reveal that he's not human, right, is a major reveal in the story. And to have a bunch of characters with the same face, as is implied in Alien Romulus, makes no sense. Because if the android if the synthetic person has, a million copies of him working elsewhere in the system, there'd be people who are like, I know you, and be like, I know you, I know you, I know you. That doesn't make sense. You can't have mass-produced, like, covert science officers that all have the same face. You could do it in the terms of like the Terminator series, right? We have those future war scenes where there's a Terminator trying to infiltrate the people that are trying to defend themselves in their little hovels, right? And one of them might look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but another one looks like a different bodybuilder, right? That's the idea, is that you couldn't infiltrate with an army of identical Arnold Schwarzenegger bots because people would say, you look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you're almost certainly a Terminator. And so, making these things internally consistent is hard work. It's not easy. And a lot of writers these days don't want to take the time to actually try to make things internally consistent. That's one of the things that I've had to struggle with in my writing too. Like, I've had to come up with rules for like so in my science fiction series, the one thing that I kind of do to get to make things work a little bit easier is I have faster than light travel. I call it shelf space, and the reasoning behind that is kind of funny, but we'll get into that some other time. But I had to come up with a series of rules as to how it works. Like, number one, and like I have to try to make that consistent with earlier stories that I've written where maybe some of these rules weren't quite solid in my head at the same time. And so, like, you add on new ideas, but you have to make sure that those new ideas work with the old stuff as well as possible. So, for instance, in shelf space, you can only go in a straight line without dropping out, reorienting, and going in a different direction. I use that in the novel that I'm currently finishing up as like a thing. And it hasn't really come up in the previous stories that I've written, but there's no reason that it couldn't work that way, right? It just hasn't been used yet in that way. But the fact that you can do this thing in a straight line gives implications, basically, that people would know, oh, if I can only jump in a straight line, then what I need to do is I need to do multiple jumps in order to avoid being followed to where I'm going. And that also comes up. You have to look at how intelligent, reasonable people would interact with the rules as well, and what kinds of incentives and what kind of tricks they would play, knowing that those rules exist. And there are cases where it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. I need to think about this. Wait a minute, why did this character do this? It's actually, hard to keep all that stuff together sometimes. And like, that's one of the hard parts of writing something, especially something that builds on something else, either an existing universe or an existing, system of lore. And it seems to me like what's been going on in the very popular media stuff is that people have not been putting in the actual time and effort to make things consistent very often. And that's what we've got here in Beetlejuice, is that the result that the character is getting doesn't make sense based on what we know of the character. There's no connective tissue that leads us there. And it doesn't even make sense from the perspective of a rational person in that situation, right? It's like, well, if you weren't prepared to get slings and arrows for doing your podcast about speaking to the ghost world, you wouldn't do the podcast about speaking with the ghost world. You would know ahead of time, as a reasonably intelligent person, that you're going to suffer those slings and arrows. And to pretend that, like, oh, I'm so depressed that people don't believe me that I'm talking about a ghost world is totally irrational, especially considering what these characters know about the world that they exist in. We make a bunch of goofy references. One of the references that we make is to one of our earlier half-blind reviews that is up over on Justin's YouTube channel for Batman versus Superman, where there's the television show Smallville, and there's a line in it: "Our home is our poison." It's just so ridiculous. we throw that all in on this podcast episode. So I will have a link here so that you guys can go check that out if you feel like it. It's about an hour and a half podcast. We do this once a week. It's pretty fun. We bring in lots of crazy references, and then me and Justin get to kind of bounce off of each other and make more jokes than we could on our own, possibly. I don't know. He's pretty good at making up jokes. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're seeing here and you want to help the channel, you know what to do. And I will see you tomorrow with some more fun writing-related stuff, perhaps. Maybe game-related stuff. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Anyway, see you next time. GOG up until December 13th. Make Warcraft live forever is, I think, the coupon code, and you capitalize each word but no spaces. You should see it on the screenshot. Anyway, that is my quick public service announcement for people who love Warcraft, and I